So this next story is quite complex. We'll try and simplify as we go along. But the Independent Development Trust is in the headlines, and this time the focus is on its CEO, Tebogo Malaka. It's believed the IDT paid a company belonging to Malaka's apparent sister-in-law more than 33 million rand, mainly for projects related to the building of schools between 2011 and 2017. Malaka is also under the spotlight over allegations that she spent over 18 million rand in cash on properties here in Gauteng, over 4 million rand as well on 2 luxury vehicles. The Public Works Minister, Dean McPherson, has initiated an investigation into these allegations. Let's talk now to the investigative journalist who carried out this investigation and wrote that story at the Daily Maverick, Pieter Myburg. Pieter, good morning to you and welcome to the program. So let's start off, if we may, because it's quite a complex series of twists and turns in the story with the big picture. What first drew your attention to Tebogo Malaka and these asset purchases?
Yeah, good morning, Iman. Yeah, so the additional context, apart from those issues around the contracts awarded to allegedly the sister-in-law, Daily Maverick in October last year, October 2024, published an article on an 800 million rand oxygen plants initiative in which the IDT was one of the foremost players. So the IDT was acting as a implementing agent for the Department of Health, the National Department of Health. And then we're going to roll out this massive project across 55 hospitals all over South Africa for the installation of oxygen plants. And we, in a series of investigative reports, highlighted key apparent shortcomings in the awarding of that contract and also kind of glaring red flags in terms of the main contract, the bulking, which just did not appear to be properly equipped or registered with the appropriate bodies to deal in medical equipment. So there's a background of contentious contracts awarded by the IDT, and then we've now placed on in the public record a series of multi-million rand property acquisitions that Ms. Malaka purchased throughout 2023 through trusts, and most of which was executed via cash or non-bonded payments. So there are substantial cash payments for assets that Ms. Malaka embarked on, and we are raising questions over how exactly those purchases were funded.
All right. So I guess what's important is that you describe this as a 22 million rand asset splurge. And how unusual would this kind of spending be for a public sector executive?
Yeah, look, so that would be for the added context, just by the way, is that the IDT board, considering all these questionable contracts that have been unearthed by the likes of Daily Maverick and some other media, they've also recently greenlighted a forensic lifestyle audit of the top executives at the IDT and other kind of key personnel in procurement, etc. So, that's a very important question, is the affordability factor in these kind of purchases. So certainly a CEO of a body like the IDT will be earning especially in the South African context, a considerable salary, probably, I would guess, judging by recent annual reports that I've studied, around 2.9 or maybe 3 million rand. But in lifestyle and affordability investigations and from a forensics perspective, a very sudden spending of large, substantial chunks of money, big purchases, amounting to 18 million rand. If we include those vehicles, 22 million rand, that still raises questions about the source of funds, regardless of what the actual monthly or annual income would be. And, I think we just also have to remind the public that this is a critical media in South Africa doing its work. So there's a public official who does have proximity to what look to be questionable contracts. And then also concurrently, there are these substantial cash purchases. So we are raising questions over whether those are funded by means of legitimate sources or whether it might be possibly or allegedly linked to some of these dubious contracts that the IDT embarked on over the last couple of years.
Because you've just mentioned now, and this is what your investigation has yielded, that the properties were bought in cash. There were no bank loans, no bonds, but there were the creation, and I think there were 2 trusts that were created, which received amounts of money, which your story asserts isn't quite clear what the sources were. Is that correct?
That is 100% correct, Iman. So if we can break it down quickly, there are two apartments that were bought respectively in Bryanston and then in Centurion. And then that amounts to about 2 million rand. But then there's a 3.6 million rand cash purchase for a plot in the Waterfall Country Estate. And then on top of that, there's a 12 million rand construction project for building a 700 square meter house on that plot on the Waterfall Country Estate. And then the Porsche Cayenne SUV and also the Range Rover Sport, which brings us to about 22 million rand. So it's certainly, and once again, all of this occurred in a very narrow space of time throughout 2023. So a very rapid accumulation of assets, most of which were funded through cash purchases. We also very upfront when we interact with the likes of Ms. Malaka. We approach it as a conversation, very openly, hope to engage with her to, open up and inform us of, maybe these are family business dealings that are legitimate and there are additional sources of funding. And we welcome that kind of interaction, because obviously then that would, lead to us not reporting on the matter whatsoever. But if they react in the way that they do, and the readers can read the piece and consult how they've kind of closed down and indicated that they're not going to answer any questions and it's not a public matter, then we still remain with these questions. Where does the actual all those millions of rands comes from to effectively sponsor these asset acquisitions?
And we'll circle back to that, but I want to go to why this is important in terms of her appointment and the IDT as being the head, the face, the leader of this institution. Why is the IDT important? And why what would seem, as your story suggests, the unusual spending of a public sector executive is important?
Yeah, look, so the IDT is one of those kind of important and kind of prominent, actually, state bodies that for many years has kind of slipped under the radar, really. We haven't really focused on them as much as a Transnet or an Eskom or those kind of bodies, but they are nevertheless very important. They slot in under the Department of Public Works, and they act as these, as I've mentioned before, implementing agent for the likes of the Department of Health and also the Department of Public Works, and also other client departments throughout the kind of state sphere, where they then kind of coordinate these, what they call social upliftment sort of projects, things like oxygen plants. They're also involved in, for instance, the refurbishments or repairing the damages at that OR Tambo Memorial Hospital out on the East Rand that was damaged severely by that tanker explosion a couple of years ago. So they would also then step in that kind of regard. And also, in terms of that contract, there's also questions about alleged bribes being paid by the contractor to top officials. So it is a very important body. It does annually kind of deal with or execute multi-billion rand, contracts that involves obviously taxpayers' money because it's funded by the state bodies. So in that sense, it's vitally important that the leadership of entities like the IDT are, beyond reproach and are, open to scrutiny as soon as there's any question about, expenditure and their personal lifestyles.
Yeah.
Which is why, once again, this is by no means a solo effort by a media house targeting, a CEO. There's also a IDT board decision. It has a separate board of trustees that also oversees the IDT's workings. And they also view these issues as serious enough to have approved that board resolution to launch these lifestyle audits, which I presume a forensic firm or a law firm of such would now embark on too.
Before we go on, do you know what the time frame is for the outcome in that lifestyle audit process? Have they said?
Yeah, I've spoken to the IDT board. They couldn't give me a clear sort of deadline for when they'd wrap up. They did indicate that it's a matter of urgency, and that they'll start with the lifestyle audits in the top management. That would include the likes of Malaka, and then also key personnel who work in procurement and those kind of sectors where the contracts are signed off on.
So, I'm going to go to Malaka's representative after our interview, Pieter, but their team, the legal team, has already been in touch with you, as you've reported, saying the trusts are income sources, or the trust's income sources are, quote, not public information. And as you say, as a public executive, that's not good enough. And for right now, what you're doing is raising a red flag. Am I correct in, the size and the scale of these purchases, the asset acquisitions, because you don't believe it passes the smell test quite yet?
It doesn't know. So typically, and look, it's not my first rodeo. You'd recall, similar instances where top officials did enrich themselves via these sort of government contracts. And we're not saying we possess that evidence at the moment, but at the position or the point where we're at now, certainly, anybody who acquires that many assets in such a short space of time, it does raise questions in terms of where the money actually comes from. And hopefully, Ms. Malaka can actually point to the contrary and say that, she's been involved in additional business dealings and it's above board and she funded it by that means. But if that's not the case, then obviously then the relevant law enforcement bodies, etc., would have to examine those transactions more closely.
What's interesting but also concerning, Pieter, is how things can take a little bit of a personal turn. And after your media inquiries, there was a wave of social media pushback, what you describe in your piece as fake screenshots and misinformation campaigns that were targeting you. What was that like, and what does that tell you? And how do you know they were fake?
Yeah, so it's kind of irksome when the journalist becomes part of the story, but it does happen in, the South African media
believe me,
space.
I know. I've been there, Pieter.
I do know. My commiserations. And certainly, but in our case, luckily, at each and every point in time, we can prove these as fake. So I've already proved the WhatsApp messages as fake. They clearly messed it up in terms of how they positioned the so-called conversation. WhatsApp, as a blue bubble or a green bubble for the one party and a white bubble for the other party, and they essentially messed up by switching up the two, etc. Anyway, that's just a technicality. But what is concerning, I think, in our political space, in our news space, is how quickly disinformation does find wings and then flip through the news space and become a little bit of a side story. Clearly, luckily, I think savvy South Africans do see through this. We've got a whole history of the Bell Pottinger type activities where the attention they try to draw the attention away from the main issues, the state capture, the corruption, and then try to blend in these issues around journalists and so-called nefarious plots, etc. And I might just add, it's also, if it happens in Twitter or X and those kind of spaces, is one thing, but when prominent politicians like Mr. Herman Mashaba from Action SA, he can't seem to disabuse himself of this constant reposting of these disinformation issues. And clearly, that's probably more an attempt to discredit these political foes, in this instance, Minister Dean McPherson, obviously. But, again, we've pointed out to Action SA and to Herman Mashaba that these are fake WhatsApps, but they nevertheless use their platforms to disseminate these fake WhatsApp messages, which is very concerning, I think, for somebody of the ilk and stature of Mr. Herman Mashaba.
Yeah. I want to close with what you say, that our reportage comes with an important caveat. We neither possess any evidence that the assets were purchased with funds linked to IDT contracts, nor are we suggesting this is the case. So just pick up that sentence after the caveat, which I think you explained in the beginning, as to why then you've gone after this particular story, which has triggered, as you've also mentioned, that lifestyle audit process from the board at the IDT.
Yeah, look, so I think the broader context is very important. So that is our caveat. But we say that these very rapid asset acquisitions do not happen sort of without a context, without in isolation. It has been preceded by an 800 million rand oxygen plants contract that has all the makings of an allegedly corrupt deal. It's been preceded by questions over the OR Tambo Memorial Project, where alleged bribes were found to have been paid to the DG of the Health Department, DG Sandile Buthelezi. It happens in the context of those 33 million rand payments to the very IDT CEO Malaka's sister-in-law, as those other media reports highlighted. So I think that the context is sufficient to then highlight these asset acquisitions and to at least afford the public the right to know what sort of financial transactions she was involved in, and then to hopefully add their voices to a call for further probes into exactly where the money comes from. Public officials hold a very important position in the South African sort of sphere space. And I think we have to normalize being critical of their financial dealings and even their private dealings, because the two are frequently blended. As we know in South Africa, unfortunately, there's been so many cases of public officials enriching themselves through these sort of dealings. We're not saying at this point we can prove it, but I think a critical probing press has the right to at least ask whether these, quite eye-watering purchases were done legitimately or not. And then we have to keep our eye and sort of delve into the story. And we also, our investigation is continuing. We are looking at the construction project at the Waterfall Country Estate, etc., just to determine where exactly 12 million rand is currently coming from to build that property for Malaka's trust.
All right, investigative journalist at Daily Maverick, Pieter Myburg, thank you for sharing that story with us.